Tucker Carlson jumps the shark in a massive fashion, platforming noted neo-Nazi Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes earlier this week. The right is in a state of chaos. What does it even mean to be on the right these days? What does it mean to be a part of the MAGA coalition? Is that in fact what these folks are actually trying to do? Are they trying to destroy MAGA? We're going to get into all of that and more with Seth Dillon, the CEO of the Babylon Bee. Stay tuned for that a little bit later in today's episode of The Josh Hammer Show. I would very much prefer to dedicate my sole exclusive attention to fighting the civilizational arsonists on the radical, woke, anti-American, anti-Western, anti-biblical left. Truly, genuinely, earnestly, honest to God. Honest to God. If I had my druthers, the left would be the recipient of not 95% of my frustrations, of my anger, of my vexations, rage, whatever you want to call it. They would be the recipients of all of it. 100%. And it certainly is true that if you look, broadly speaking, which side, the left, the right, which of America's two major political parties, which of these parties, which of these movements is more foundationally, is more fundamentally the anti-American, anti-civilizational force, you certainly would say that is the left. No ifs, ands, or buts. The two sides are not equal, or frankly, anywhere close to it in that respect. But it has gotten to the point, on the other hand, where it is not only impossible, it is irresponsible to ignore the rot within the American right's own henhouse. For my entire adult life, where I've had political opinions, I have never shied away from this for whatever it is worth. I have no compunctions about calling out moral atrocity, strategic idiocy, or just general stupidity wherever it raises its ugly head. And especially over the past 2 years, give or take, not so coincidentally corresponding to the commencement of the Hamas pogrom on October 7, 2023, you really have seen the rise of some very anti-American, anti-Western, anti-biblical forces on the American political scene. Tucker Carlson, the erstwhile king of cable news on Fox News, is front and center for all of this. We have not shied away from criticizing Tucker Carlson before. It makes me sad, actually. Years ago, back when Tucker was hosting his Fox News show, I had a number of friends who actually said to me, Josh, do you think Tucker Carlson is anti-Semitic? Do you think he's anti-Israel? Is he maybe even a crypto pseudo-left-winger? Is he actually just anti-America? And I defended Tucker. I defended Tucker every single time for years and years and years. I went on his Fox News show back in 2022. Met him in person on the studio at a separate time at Fox. We had pleasant email correspondences. It brings me no pleasure to criticize Tucker Carlson as much as I have been doing. But he has become the leading tip of the spear of what can only be described as a cancerous force threatening to engulf the entire American right. Because the typical filth that he is putting up on his show, not every day, not every episode, but a shockingly high percentage of it these days, seems geared toward a few things. One is undermining Jewish-Christian relations. We're going to get into all that and more a little bit later with Seth Dillon. Two is undermining the American right itself. Because when you try to drive a stake through the two biblical religions, through Judaism and Christianity, when you try to drive a stake through the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, when you try to drive a stake through America and its moral and spiritual foundations in the Bible itself, in the land of Israel, something that the founders knew all too well. Benjamin Franklin won the National Seal of the United States to be Moses parting the Red Sea. When you try to drive that stake, you are fundamentally engaging in a subjugation. You are subjugating the American right and the MAGA coalition. So Tucker early this week platforms Nick Fuentes. I've had Nick Fuentes blocked on social media for a decade. I've known who this kid was since he was 17 years old. He started making a big stink for himself in 2017, 2018, perhaps most infamous for this horrific video that started making the rounds in 2019, where he compares the Nazis massacring the Jews in Germany and the German-occupied territories back in the day. He compares them to Cookie Monster from Sesame Street baking cookies in an oven, and with this really satanic, demonic smile on his face, says that, oh, the 6 million number just doesn't make sense. I'm not actually buying it. Doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense at all, Nick Fuentes said. That's who Tucker Carlson is now sanitizing on his show. But one of the purposes of our newly relaunched show as part of our partnership between Newsweek and Salem Media Group is to carry on the torch of Salem's own Charlie Kirk, my late friend. And Charlie Kirk had thoughts on Nick Fuentes and people like that. Go ahead and watch this clip.
Why don't you have anybody dissenting from the right? When are we going to have more nationalists? Instead of just engaging with the left, now that the Biden administration has invaded our country, when are we going to build a big tent with nationalists like Jared Taylor and Nick Fuentes?
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I don't align with Jew haters. Sorry. Thank you. I'll talk to anybody. You want to tell me why do you hate the Jews, by the way? What do you think of Jewish people?
No, I think they have a disproportionate influence in American politics. However, I do find it interesting that you trot out these far left
I'll
midwits.
talk to anybody, but one of the people you mentioned says we should have a holy war against the Jews. Do you believe that?
I believe we need to spread the light
yes
of Christ
or no?
to the entire
Do you
world.
believe in a holy war against the Jews? Yes or no?
I believe in fighting for Christ. And I believe that Jerusalem should be Christian.
Christ was a Jew.
Christ is king.
I agree Christ is king, but yes or no? This is not a trick question.
Do you
believe in a holy war against the Jews? Yes or no? Not a trick question.
Do you think we should try to convert
Why?
Israelis to Christianity?
Why?
Yes, I try to convert everyone to Christianity. I try to convert Dennis to Christianity. I try to do it every day. It's the Great Commission.
You know what?
But here's what I'm not going to put up with. I'm not going to put up with Jew hatred. In the conservative movement, in America, I'm not going to put up with that in any way, shape, or form. I'm not going to put up with it. And I'm not going to put up with it. It's disgusting. It's reprehensible.
Charlie Kirk despised Nick Fuentes. For Tucker Carlson, a man who guest hosted Charlie's show shortly after his tragic assassination, who spoke at his memorial service in Arizona last month, for him to have on Nick Fuentes a month and a half after the assassination is an astonishing betrayal. But it has massive ramifications for the American right. Because with every psychopath, with every Holocaust denier, every Putin puppet, every Hamas Iran shill that you let into the quote-unquote right, you're going to lose a lot more reasonable voters. You're going to lose a lot more people in the middle who have not lost their everlasting minds. Make no mistake about it. This superficially looks like an anti-Jewish operation, and it is that. But more profoundly, it is also an anti-evangelical Christian operation and an anti-MAGA operation. These folks want nothing more than to destroy the MAGA coalition and to construct a God-forsaken, wretched, neo-pagan, anti-biblical, anti-Western, anti-American coalition in its place. Tucker Carlson knows that. Nick Fuentes knows that. They all know it. The fox is not just in the henhouse. The fox is ensconced, is comfortable in the henhouse. And the victim could be the entire MAGA coalition, the entire modern conservative movement, the entire modern Republican coalition. Well, you really can't have a conversation about the state of the right and the health or lack of health on the right these days without bringing in Seth Dillon. Seth Dillon, of course, is the CEO of the Babylon Bee. You're familiar with the Babylon Bee. You can check them out at babylonbee.com. Seth Dillon, it's been a few years. I think you last joined the show back when we were in audio-only form at our beginning, but it's wonderful to welcome you back to the Josh Hammer Show. Thank you, my friend, for joining.
Yeah, we're upgrading now. We got the video going. That's cool. Great to be back.
We got the video, we got the Salem partnership, and most importantly, we have Seth Dillon as our guest. So, Seth, I mean, it's kind of one of those days where it's where can we possibly begin? You and I, our names have been dragged through the mud by all sorts of horrific provocateurs over the past couple of months. You and I were at this now somewhat infamous Hamptons retreat. It was the last time that I saw Charlie Kirk in person. I'm sure it was the last time that you saw him as well. And we're going to get into all of that, but I want to just dive in with this, which is you had an essay for the Free Press, for Barry Weiss's publication last week. The essay was titled "The Foolishness of No Enemies to the Right." To be clear, these topics are all very much related to one another, but I figured that we would set the table there. So, Seth, tell us about this essay that you wrote for the Free Press, this whole debate about no enemies to the right. What was the purpose of this essay, and what is your basic stance on the matter?
Well, I call it foolishness because I think it's, honestly, I think it's suicidal to have this mentality that there's just no rules on your own side. Anything goes. No matter how radical or extreme or hateful the views are on my side, I'm going to overlook that because, the argument, this is how the argument goes, unity is what's needed in order to defeat the left, and the left are the real bad guys. And so it's like this friend-enemy distinction thing where if someone is on your side, they're your friend, and if they're on the other side of the aisle, they're your enemy, and it's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter what they think or what they've said or what they've done. I reject that, and I reject it for a number of reasons. For one thing, I don't think that it's beneficial to the movement to have the radicals gaining prominence and power and mainstreaming them. I don't think it will help us. I think if anything, the left is actually a cautionary tale along those lines because their radicals were given the reins. They did amass quite a bit of cultural and institutional power, but I think they pushed it too far. And now we're seeing some backlash from that. We're seeing a lot of response where people are, gravitating more towards reason, sanity, truth. They are rejecting the left's radical agenda because it went so insane. It went so far. And that's because the radicals were handed the reins. And so I don't see it as being politically expedient. I haven't seen a good argument for why winning, if you want to call it winning, requires unity with our, worst fringe and factions. That doesn't make any sense to me. No one's really articulated to me how that works. But beyond that, of course, there's the moral argument. I don't think it's morally good to suggest that the left doesn't have any principles, so why should we? Those kinds of things. This stuff can be overlooked for the purpose of winning. I don't think so at all. I think we should care very much about the health of our movement. And so what I did there in that piece was I likened the bad ideas on our side to cancer. I think bad ideas, not just on our side but anywhere, are cancerous in the sense that they spread very quickly, especially if they're not treated properly, and they do tremendous damage. And so, my perspective as a satirist, a humorist, running the Babylon Bee is that we should be targeting bad ideas for destruction. We should be trying to root them out and destroy them. We should be exposing them for what they are and dealing with them appropriately, not overlooking them just because they're on our side. In fact, I think that's just, a self-defeating and very cynical play.
We're chatting with Seth Dillon. If by some fluke instance you are not already following him, check him out on X at Seth Dillon, on Instagram at BChief. The Babylon Bee is found at babylonbee.com. Seth, there's a lot to unpack there, but among the things you said that I want to just briefly elaborate on, I find ludicrous this notion that the American right, the conservative movement, the Republican Party, whoever we want to define what it means to be on the right from a political perspective, the notion that the right cannot win unless we let the craziest, most insane, most hyper-conspiratorial voices into the fold and perhaps even have a seat at the command station. To me, there is no basis for making this assertion. In fact, if you look at the left, if you look at the Democratic coalition, one of the reasons, seems to me at least, that they got shellacked pretty badly last November is that they have indeed let the crazies into the henhouse, and in many ways, the inmates are running the asylum. So this notion of a pure politically expedient means to an end, I just find totally preposterous.
Yeah,
but
how does it help? So, have you ever seen someone explain how it helps or how it could do anything but hurt? I've never seen anyone do that. The argument is just simply that unity is, but it's kind of this simple idea, which makes sense on the surface, that if we're together, we're stronger. right? That's kind of like the basic thing is like unity is good. And if we have unity, we can fight. I think health is good. I think if you're unhealthy, it's hard to fight. It's hard to be strong. And so it just doesn't make any sense to me. Unity with something really bad poisons the whole thing. It's just like if you have a rotten vegetable sitting next to another one, the rot spreads. Well, I don't see how that positions us for wins, and I don't see that it makes much. I don't really consider it much of a win either. If just bad people on the other side are given power, who's winning in that case?
Yeah, and part of this debate boils down to what is the nature of a political coalition. And my basic definition is that there are plenty of public policy issues of secondary or tertiary concern that I think is totally fine to disagree upon. You can have some folks on the right who believe in a progressive income tax, some who believe in a flat income tax, things like that. That's fine. Some folks who want to totally cut off or severely limit legal immigration, some folks who still want large quantities of legal immigrants, that's totally fine. But if there are folks within a purported coalition who are saying that there are other folks in that coalition that are filth, are subhuman, that literally do not belong in the coalition, perhaps don't even belong in America, then you have ceased to have a coalition. You've ceased to have a political movement in any sense of the term. But another aspect of this debate, Seth, and one that I think that you're particularly well qualified to opine on, in fact, I've seen you do so on social media, is a debate over free speech and platforming, right? This is a source of constant confusion. As a lawyer myself, I am oftentimes just banging my head on the table because of how often folks seem to misunderstand this there. But when you get accused of doing this, drawing boundaries and line drawing thing and say that no, actually there are some voices that should not be welcome to speak at a particular conference or to go on a particular show, you oftentimes get accused of being a censor, or how dare you, Seth Dillon, or how dare you, Josh Hammer, you don't believe in the Constitution, you don't believe in the First Amendment. So how do you respond to that?
Well, you have to make a distinction between things that are different. If an organization decides not to invite you or not to invite me because our views or values are at odds with theirs, or they just don't like us, they have every right to make those decisions themselves. You're not entitled to anybody's platform. You are entitled, as someone who enjoys First Amendment protections, to be able to speak in the public square without having somebody censor your voice. But those are two very different things. That having access to the public square, the free marketplace of ideas to try to advance your ideas, is very different than having access to someone else's show or someone else's stage, because those things are not the public square. And so the confusion normally comes, and I think it's deliberate most of the time. I don't think that people would really just miss the mark here and just don't understand I think they're deliberately trying to conflate things in order to make it seem like you're calling for censorship when you're not. But yeah, everybody has the right to associate with who they want to platform who they want to. You can get into a deeper conversation about whether or not the social media companies like X, for example, or Facebook have obligations to platform people. Are they platforms for free expression without barriers, or do they, as private companies, enjoy the right to decide who they want on their platform and who they don't, based on the content of their speech, the viewpoint discrimination kind of thing? That's a bigger discussion, because those platforms are where a lot of public discourse is taking place, and there's a huge debate around whether or not they should be allowed to censor like that. But we're not talking about those platforms either. This is like, should Turning Point USA, would they be censoring Tucker Carlson if they stopped inviting him? No, of course not. That's not censorship.
I couldn't agree with you more, of course, and this is one of the areas where Charlie Kirk and I personally disagreed. I generally agreed with Charlie's overall stance when it comes to line drawing. To bring in the elephant in the room in our conversation, Charlie was adamant that Nick Fuentes would not be a part of Turning Point USA conferences. There is an infinite amount of footage on the internet, on YouTube, of Charlie Kirk saying that Nick Fuentes is groypers, that whole neo-Nazi wing is just simply not going to get into Turning Point USA.
Yeah, he liked to have a broad coalition, but he did have certain places where he would draw his lines, for sure.
Absolutely. And the question, therefore, to me, is always not the principled one as to whether or not you will literally let anyone in, but rather it's the prudential one as to who is in and who is out. So that then takes us to the news of the week this week, which is Tucker Carlson, fairly fresh off of immediately guest hosting the Charlie Kirk show after Charlie's horrific assassination, shortly after his controversial speech at the Arizona NFL Stadium where Charlie Kirk was memorialized there. He is now barely a month and a half after Charlie's horrific assassination brought on the individual who I think it's probably fair to say Charlie Kirk despised maybe more than anyone in America just because of the sheer personal animosity and the troubles that Nick Fuentes caused Charlie and his now widow Eric over the years by just showing up at the conferences and just making a big stink of it there. And now Tucker has had Nick Fuentes on his show, and he has engaged in what can only be described as a sanitation operation, trying to sanitize him for the masses. I mean, before we kind of get into any details there, what's just your basic take as what this says, not just about Tucker, but also what it says to him when it comes to his purported professed friendship or loyalty to Charlie? This seems to be nothing less than an astonishing betrayal to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do think, going back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, Tucker can have anybody on his show that he wants to. I don't think anybody has any right to tell Tucker you must not or you cannot have that person on your show. I'll never be invited back on Tucker's show. I don't know if you've been on it before, but he'll never have you on again, I'm sure. And that's not censorship. But he's got the right to talk to Nick if he wants to. I think what a lot of people are expecting, though, from a conversation like that is if you're going to bring somebody who's like the leader of the Grifters, who has so much animosity for Jews and is just, he says the most horrible things, like he said, well, I don't even know if I can repeat some of the things that he said, but, he's called J.D. Vance names, calling him fat and ugly and that he has a brown family, like just his attitude towards minorities, towards women, towards Jews, and the things that he said, the glorification of Hitler, these are all things that you would think Tucker, claiming to be a Christian and a decent person, would have a lot of interest in pressing Nick on and saying, look, I'm going to challenge you in this conversation. I'm not just going to puff you up and promote you. But it looks like he chose the latter route. This was much more marketing than it was journalism. It was much more, just giving Nick a way into the mainstream where he'll be taken more seriously and seen as more reasonable, rather than using that opportunity to take his own free speech in response to Nick's free speech and say, I don't like your ideas, dude. You've got some bad ideas. You've got a lot of hatred in your heart. You've said this, and this. How do you explain yourself? He could challenge him. This is one of the things that Tucker's done so well, too, so effectively. If you go back through the years and look at what Tucker used to do at Fox, they would put these Democrats, they'd bring liberals on the show and have them sit across from Tucker, and he would laugh at them, and he would mock them, and he would tear apart their arguments. He'd make them look silly. He'd make them look foolish. He's actually very good at doing that. But he doesn't do that anymore. Now, mostly what he does is he kind of launders these bad actors and bad ideas through his show by giving them a very soft, very gentle interview where he doesn't challenge them on the toughest things. And the only conclusion you can draw from that is that he's not challenging them because he doesn't disagree with them. And that's the conclusion that a lot of people are reaching about this. So, Tucker had every right to do it, and people have every right to criticize him for how he handled it.
Yeah, he brings on these guests who it seems to me that he is too cowardly to actually say the things that he wants to say, and effectively has the guests speak vicariously for him. That is a long-standing trend. We all saw that in the Darryl Cooper episode that came out around Labor Day weekend 2024, who is essentially saying that the Nazis did not necessarily intend to gas 6 million Jews. They were just a bunch of displaced persons in camps there. And it seems to me that is what he is doing. But among the other things...
That's the reason, by the way, that Tucker considers me a traitor. He calls me a betrayer, and talks about me constantly, just trashes me on his show, because I took issue with how he handled that interview. Not that he had the interview, but how he handled the interview. It was simply that, a simple disagreement with him. And he treats me like I'm this terrible person, and then sits down across from somebody who's literally telling him, I'm a huge fan of Stalin. I celebrate his birthday. I've admired him for a long time. And he's got nothing to say to challenge that, to push back on that, to say, this is actually despicable and gross and disgusting. He thinks I'm despicable, and the guy across from him praising Stalin is a great guy. I mean, how do you make sense of that? In what world does that make sense?
Well, it does make sense. It's frankly just outright evil. So, folks, again, we're chatting with Seth Dillon. You can follow him on X at Seth Dillon, Instagram at BChief. Check out the Babylon Bee, babylonbee.com. Seth, among the other things that Tucker, above all, I would say, is doing, but others in that orbit are doing as well, but he really is the tip of the spear on this, I would argue, is trying to drive, at this point, what is an unmistakable wedge between Christians and Jews. And there are many tactics that he is employing here. There are many verses that he is citing from the Bible. I want to get your reaction to one thing, and then we'll kind of have a follow-up or two, which is he had a guest on his show in August, a well-known pastor by the name of Cliff Nelty. And Tucker made, I thought, an astonishing confession. Astonishing. He admitted that for the first time in his life last year, which based on my Wikipedia search would make Tucker 55 years old when this happens, he said for the first time last year he actually read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, at the age of 55. Okay, fine. I mean, you're a Johnny-come-lately to religion. I guess that's fine. Better late than never. But then he said that upon reading the Old Testament, he was shocked at the murder and the violence and the genocide in the Old Testament. Now, the pastor, to his great credit, did not take the bait at all, presumably because he's read the Bible prior to the age of 55. But Tucker, it seems to me, Seth, and it's hard for me as an observant Jew to say this, but it seems to me that he's literally heretical on Christianity's own terms. Because this, to me, this professed distinction between this vengeful, wrathful God of the Old Testament and the loving God of the New Testament of Jesus Christ, this seems to me to be a form of Marcionism, of a second century theological heresy, whereby the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament. So am I right on this? And does that make it as doubly ironic that when Tucker criticizes other forms of Christians, such as Christian Zionists, that maybe he's actually the one who's quite literally heretical on Christianity's own terms?
Well, it's interesting because that line of attack is an old one, and it's generally brought forth by leftists and atheists. Honestly, right. You know, with the rise of the new atheism in the late '90s, early 2000s, I guess it was. You know, this was a common line of attack against Christianity, was that the God of the Bible is this moral monster, this genocidal dictator, no mercy, no compassion. Just rage and anger and destruction. And, you know, there's Christian apologists spent a lot of time, spilled a lot of ink, and gave a lot of speeches and engaged in a lot of debates, engaging with those arguments. A great book on that topic is by a friend of mine, actually, Paul Copan. He wrote a book titled "Is God a Moral Monster?" Dealing with that question of, you know, the God of the Old Testament and some of those objections. It's interesting to hear somebody like Tucker, you know, echoing some of that stuff. What jumped out to me, you mentioned before, you know, that it seemed like it was a betrayal for Tucker to have this man on his show that, you know, that Charlie wasn't friends with. I mean, you know, whether you categorize it that way or not, you know, Tucker doesn't have to hate everybody that Charlie hated. I don't think that that's necessary. Does it dishonor, you know, Charlie's stance on these things? Maybe to some extent. But what definitely did was Tucker's own words when he talked about how Christian Zionism is heresy. You know, he's talking about a position that Charlie Kirk himself held, and many Christians hold. It's a common belief. It's a common interpretation. It's not universal amongst Christians. You know that the modern nation state of Israel is the fulfillment of prophecies from the Old Testament, and that we should have a certain attitude or posture towards Israel as a result of things that we read in the Bible. You know, is that a universally held belief? No, it's not. But it was one that Charlie held. You know, he rooted a lot of his love and concern for the state of Israel in his love for the scriptures, the Bible, and what he'd learned from the Bible. And so, you know, I mean, that's textbook Christian Zionism, is it not? And that's what Tucker was calling heresy. And so, you know, you have, if you're calling that heresy, I don't think he even understands what the word heresy means, because you can have doctrinal differences about, you know, the end times or, you know, the creation narrative or whatever, and you can have these kinds of differences which don't amount to heresy. You know, it's not actually in contradiction of the basic truths of Christianity, like what C.S. Lewis would have called mere Christianity. And so, you know, that to me is what jumped out as a very remarkable and a kind of astonishing statement, is that he would go so far as to call Charlie himself. Like, what was he doing? If he thought that Charlie was a heretic, what was he doing speaking at his memorial?
No, it's a fantastic question. I mean, and that is one of the many reasons that I view this as just an astonishing act of personal betrayal. I mean, not that I claim to speak for Charlie, who is no longer here to defend his own honor, but I mean, you're right. I mean, there's this photo that Charlie posted shortly after October 7th. I saw it from November 2023 in a very quick Twitter search of him at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. He's wearing the kippah, the Jewish skull cap, his hand on the wall. And he quotes Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, which is one of the favorite verses most often quoted by Mike Huckabee, Pastor John Hagee, a lot of the older generation of Christian Zionists. This notion that God will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, God speaking to the patriarch Abraham. Actually, funny aside, that's actually our Parsha of the Torah. Literally this Shabbat, this Saturday, we will read that in synagogues all across the world, Parsha Lech Lecha. But it seems to me like Tucker was just totally dumping on that. But Seth, let me ask you this, without getting into necessarily Genesis or any other particular book, how would you respond to those who say that if you are a Christian and you support the Jewish people, you support U.S.-Israel relations, which you obviously do, there are a lot of folks that say, oh, you have to necessarily be morally or financially blackmailed. There is no other way in the world that you could possibly arrive at this conclusion on XYZ terms. How do you respond to that sort of accusation from these disreputable types?
Well, I mean, it's the kind of knife that can cut both ways, right? Because you could just as easily make that argument in the other direction and say, the only reason you're adopting your views is because you must be paid. Well, we have to be a little bit more honest and charitable than that. People can arrive at different conclusions and for different reasons. And by the way, not everybody who supports Israel, like in their conflict with Hamas, for example, in their handling of the war, for whatever criticism you might have of that, there are still people who are supportive of Israel's right to exist and defend itself, and engage in war against people who have attacked them ruthlessly. There are people who support that without citing the Bible. You don't have to cite the Bible to do that. You can arrive at those conclusions on your own based on what's actually happening today, right now, and using your own sense of judgment and moral clarity, trying to determine and who the good guys and the bad guys are, who's actually trying to abide by the proper rules of engagement and minimize civilian casualties versus who's putting civilians at risk deliberately and taking them hostage and doing them harm. You can arrive at reasonable conclusions about these things without having to cite the Bible at all. And so, there are people who do look to the Bible. There are people who will literally never criticize Israel because they believe that they never should because that's what the Bible tells them. Fine, fair. That's but that's not everybody. So to put anybody into any of these buckets, people arrive at their conclusions for different reasons, and we can respect that. And it's certainly not a heretical viewpoint from a Christian standpoint. I mean, this is a very the dispensationalism is claimed to be heretical. I mean, these are like doctrinal beliefs that modern popular seminaries, Dallas Theological Seminary has promoted dispensationalism for decades. Every pastor coming out of that seminary and teaching in churches across the country over the course of decades, many of them very famous pastors and well-known authors, hold those kinds of views. And so, this isn't a matter of heresy. We're not talking about heresy. That's just a smear. But again, that argument that you brought up, it cuts both ways. There's just no reason to automatically assume that just because somebody disagrees with you on something, they're paid to disagree with you. I haven't been paid a dime for any of my opinions. I offer them for free, and you can enjoy them or toss them in the trash bin if you don't like them.
Well, that's frankly just the absolute way that it should be. And by the way, just an aside, this notion that you can't criticize the policies of the Israeli government. I mean, hello. I mean, anyone who's ever met an Israeli person probably knows that most Israelis have no compunctions criticizing their own government. They have one of the most raucous democracies probably on the entire face of the earth, actually, for that matter. Seth, I want to take us away from the Jews.
By the way, one of Charlie's main criticisms was that they just simply didn't defend themselves well enough.
Right.
Like that letter that he wrote to Bibi was a "help me, help you" letter. That's what he was saying in that letter. He wanted them to do a better job of PR and explaining to the world what they were doing and why they were doing it, and be more transparent and make it easier for him to defend them. That was one of his main criticisms. It wasn't like, one of these criticisms that you see coming either from the left or from the radical right, where it's, the Jews can do no right, the Jews are evil, they're engaged in genocide. That wasn't Charlie's position.
No, not at all. And I read that letter back over the summer. It was June or July. Someone on his team sent it my way. And he literally began this letter. The first sentence of this letter that he wrote to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's a very close paraphrase, is, as a Christian, one of my greatest joys in life is making friendships with the Jewish people and defending the state of Israel. I mean, he says it right off the top there. So the folks who are trying to paint him as turning at the last second as this whole absurd Candace Owens Hamptons retreat narrative involving you and Bill Ackman, to an extent me, they literally just don't know what they're talking about. I really don't know
to
how
a
to
large
say
extent
it.
you.
Yeah, no.
You're one of the main targets now at this point.
For better or for worse, my friend, I definitely am. But before I let you go, you've been very generous with your time. I want to take us away from the Jews in Israel and all that just for a second and bring us back to more or less where we began our conversation, which is talking about just the nature of the right and the nature of political coalitions in general. So I gave my very rough outlines as to how to define a political coalition. To me, it's totally fine to have amicable disagreements over secondary, tertiary issues when it comes to the relevant tax rate, the relevant immigration level, the relevant scale of America's military involvement across the world. Fine, that's all totally fair game. Where I personally draw the line is when you are dehumanizing other members of your so-called coalition. I think that at a bare minimum, that is a place to draw the line there. I mean, may we draw the line and say that folks who promote unlimited abortion are not welcome, no matter what their other views are. There's other places to try and draw the line there. I'm curious, Seth, especially in light of your excellent essay for the Free Press last week, how do you define what it means to be in a political coalition, or perhaps even more specifically on the American right these days?
Well, when you bring up that question of unity and we should be unified, the real question is, what are you unifying around? What is your coalition based on? What's the foundation of it? And I think, I agree with you. I certainly agree with you that, dehumanizing entire segments, whether it's on your side or, throughout the world, a certain race and ethnicity or religion, that's certainly very problematic. But, it also just comes down to the ideas and where you're grounding your ideas. I think that a lot of the radical right, for example, is post-constitutional. They see the Constitution as an impediment to gaining and applying, to gaining power and doing what they want to do with that power. And so I don't think that anyone who's really post-constitutional should have anything to do with the conservative movement. That's not what conservatism is about. Collectivism of any kind, that mirrors the collectivism on the left, but maybe coming at things from a different perspective, but still, this kind of either race or ethnicity based, you're guilty if you're in this group and you can do no wrong if you're in this group. And vilifying and scapegoating on the basis of these collectivist ideas, I think that has no place in the conservative movement. And so there's a number of things. You can go through a list of these things that are just kind of deal breakers when it comes to who you want in your movement. And this idea that gatekeeping, that's such a dirty word. It's almost as dirty as dispensationalism at this point. The idea that gatekeeping is wrong is as foolish as saying, having borders around your country is wrong and unacceptable, or that going to get checked by the doctor every now and then to see if you have cancer is wrong. Well, you need to know if you're healthy, and the way to stay healthy is to keep bad things out. You don't ingest bad food and fail to exercise because you want to stay healthy. Well, you don't let bad ideas and bad actors contaminate your movement because you want it to remain healthy. And so getting an idea, that's why I tried to raise the question recently. There's been a lot of dialogue about, we've had this dialogue about what is a woman, and what is an American? Well, what is a conservative? Let's have that conversation, because a lot of them on the right now are willing to admit that they're not conservatives. Well, what are they? Let's get some clear distinctions in mind here. They've said, I've seen some of them. Joel Webman recently responded to me and said, "Brothers, we are not conservatives." And they think that the conservative movement has failed so drastically and dramatically that something else needs to take its place. And so, well, if you're saying that, then you're removing yourself from our movement and you're starting a new one. And so let's get clear about what those distinctions are.
You said it very well, and I guess I'll end with this, which is what I really hear from you, Seth, if I can really distill it. this notion of kind of group-based collectivism, how it has no role. What we're really saying is that the anchoring principle, and I've been saying this for my entire adult life, the anchoring principle of what it means to be on the right, what it means to be part of the Western civilizational inheritance and the biblical inheritance, is really Genesis 1:27. It is all downstream of man being made in the divine image, in the image of God. Betrayal Melchim, we would say in the Hebrew, Imago Dei for our Catholic friends. When you are made in the image of God, when you have that spark of the divine, you have an inherent moral dignity, an inherent individual moral worth, and you deserve to be treated and recognized as such. That's really kind of what I heard from you there.
And that's bedrock stuff. That's basic stuff. You know, we not only believe in God, we believe in that we're made in God's image and that we have God-given rights. Including liberty, by the way. And so authoritarianism is out.
Yes, it is, among socialism and other notorious ideologies as well. So one final time, folks, Seth Dillon is the CEO of the Babylon Bee. Check out babylonbee.com. He's on X, at Seth Dillon, on Instagram, at BeeChief. Seth, you're a warrior for the forces of civilizational sanity. We really appreciate you coming back to join the Josh Hammer Show.
Thanks for having me, man. Good to see you.
Great to see you as well. We hope that you all enjoyed this episode of the Josh Hammer Show.